Margo Neale is my guest this morning, and she is adjunct professor, Margo Neale, actually, principal advisor to the director of the National Museum of Australia and senior curator Indigenous at the museum.
Then we caught the GAN. Do you remember the old GAN? Oh, it was I remember it was so slow. I used to, at one point around I'd get out and run along the side and hop back in another carriage, get my daily exercise. It was just so amazing, and Oodnadadat and all these. I mean, I'm kind of young and it's kind of all very interesting, but always intended to reconnect with sort of traditional Aboriginal culture at some point, and I had actually once before. And so Bruce proved to be even more convenient than I thought, because he was trained in what was called a SOPA in Sydney, and they were training people to go to the Northern Territory. So we headed up to, he'd been in Yuendamu, went to Milingimbi.
And you say we were part of the first intake of non-missionaries to live on the island after 60 years of Methodist mission rule. My arrival was like the swinging 60s meets the sobriety of medieval mores at the Methodists.
Oh, yes.
How did they deal with you, Margo?
We all got such a shock. Because Bruce had been there. Bruce had been there the 6 or 12 months before, right? Talking 1971. And so all the mission ladies had taken this single young man under their wing, and they'd taught him to plait bread and, make butter out of tin business and a whole range of things. And they were all very excited about the arrival of his wife, who thought they assumed would be very like him, very, what's the word? Modest and quiet and...
anything but ordinary.
My goodness. And I remember the day I actually, and the Aboriginal people were really thrilled too, because I already then had a skin name from when he was at the first place. I, needless to say, I ended up living in the camp more than the missionaries. But I arrived, and I remember arriving on the day with a purple, sort of like a pretend taffeta backless. I was, tanned to a crisp, Barbarella hair, wiggles, the whole lot. Made up to the hilt, lots of bangles, and, I line up in the queue, used to queue up with the ladies to get your portion. Everything was like wartime, 2 eggs, bit of turtle, buffalo, whatever they'd slaughtered that week, stuff from the garden, and I'd be in my bikinis or bathers or so, and they'd all keep this really wide berth. So there was a bit of a shock.
That time... How did it impact on you? Because you went from Milingimbi to
Maningrida.
And then it was the whole, there was the grog and petrol sniffing issues.
Yeah. Well. I only think of Milingimbi as Milingimbi was really a frontier. There's no question, in a whole range of ways. The mission had been there 60 or 100 years. They'd never had much outside stuff. The Aboriginal people at camp had learned how to make the most of the missionaries. Everyone thinks of exploitation, but it's the other way around. I mean, I hung around the camp. I know what they thought of going to church and singing and all that. And I went crabbing, I went fishing, I went turtle hunting, and I just didn't have anything much to do with the mission. I didn't have to, and so we were polite and nice. Taught at the school. Did it again. I'm always thinking about. Carpe diem, that's my thing, just seize the day. And I learned as much as I could. I ran classes and so on. Then we went off to, we lived in a little donga, little place, tin. And power went off for the night. You couldn't, mission, somehow was to stop everyone doing naughty things, which is kind of counterintuitive, really. So you'd be onslaughted by sandflies. There's so many stories about there's a different world, and we'd have to wait till they go to church so we could steal their dinghy to have a little ride in the bay. But Maningrida was a shock. Maningrida brought us right up to the present day, because it was in the throes of a government settlement. It was the beginning of actually there wasn't. Grog was not freely available. You couldn't drink there unless you had a permit, and we have a really strong sense of injustice and so on. And I really, it was a bind, because you knew alcohol, even though we hadn't had the experience of Aboriginal people from those times and those places with alcohol. I had seen enough in Darwin and other places to know that it didn't do real good to the culture. And so we were in the bind. You'd seen what it's done to
your dad.
No, it wasn't a good thing. But certainly culturally it was it's such a fine the whole cultural thing is a tightly knit chain with all the links perfectly placed, and when one bit breaks or topples, it has an extraordinary effect on marriage, promised marriages, children with identity. It's just so intense. Anyway, over time, we got into a bit of a pickle because we had our best friend was a fella called Jack Mirici, who he was trying to write his story, but he'd never been to school. And we were very close. We camped with him. We lived with him. He lived at our house. We did him and his family, and we'd have dinner parties, and he wanted to come and sit in the corner just to listen to English. He didn't want to be included. It kind of was, but and it went on. And then, one day, and we always offer him a drink, like you do. He's a guest. It was very difficult and then one day he said, no, I can't because I once went off the rails and, I can't do that anymore. And then we're talking 1972, and he actually did one day take a drink, and it was all hell broke loose back in the camp, and his mates came, and there was war. There was even threats with guns. There was police. It was terrible. It was terrible. And we went to the superintendent and said what we'd done, and how he was a friend. We were just having dinner.
So you felt responsible
we felt responsible. We did either way, we were in a terrible situation.
Okay.
Here's our friend who we can't share a drink with, who's in our house, and yet there's the other side was illegal. But he wasn't, and that's quite an interesting microcosm.
So what was that period like in terms of you, I suppose, dipping into your Aboriginal heritage?
Oh, it was really good. I remember Lynn Onus and I used to talk a lot. Do you remember Lynn Onus, the Aboriginal artist who did, you remember his work. He did the Hills Hoist with the bats hanging off.
Oh, I love that
and
work.
And the dingoes that are in the...
Yes, I do remember.
So here are great mates, and we used to talk about how, going to places like that, as he did. He used to make pilgrimages much later, like in the 80s, to Arnhem Land, and became adopted into other families and so on. And it was like getting our classical education. It wasn't like, there was this whole criticism about black fellas sort of re-indigenising. No, we just had a different journey. We all have our southern journeys, Aboriginal. If you believe that,
that's a beautiful way to put it, a classical education.
Oh, we had our popular immediate education, family education. We lived in a we lived with white people. We mixed families. And we learned to survive as people had for 200 years with Macassans, Japanese, and so on. So had the top enders, but their culture, they lived in small groups and had language and ceremony and so on. So rather than see it as a deficiency, we used to talk about how we see it as a way of connecting with our classical heritage, our classical education in a whole range of ways. And that's how I saw it, and it was really, and I did mostly, of course I worked in the school as a teacher and so on, and mixed around as we did, but I've always had to lead, a double life in that sense, I mean, I was brought up that way, so... but our, real friends, our social and recreational after hours time was in the camps, and I got into a bit of spot trouble there too, actually, another time. Trying to...
Should I continue there?
Your son... It's probably interesting in as much as all this has, current contemporary relevance in a way, I was there was a lot of stuff happening after the grog and the petrol sniffing, and there's a lot of... It was in the middle of self-determination, and Aboriginal people were supposed to be on the council running their own affairs, and we're in this tide of, house girls and house boys in between that time, colonial regime in a way, administrators, and the Aboriginal people were the people, smooth the pill over dying race thing was that era, right? But Maningrida was in the middle, and there were Aboriginal people there who knew that they had rights, and they were fairly educated, different sets, a lot of tribal hostilities because a whole lot of the wrong people were brought together in one place, like depots of assimilation almost, that's kind of what they were, but they also needed the skills to survive into the next generation. But there's a minister of Aboriginal Affairs. I can't remember who it was. I can't even remember. I never read newspapers, heard radio then. I just knew this really important guy was coming to the council office, the administration centre, and no Aboriginal people on that place knew about it. And he was coming there to talk about business, but they're still excluding the people whose business they were talking about. So I and my friend went around the camps that night and told everybody and said, you must go to there and you tell them what your concerns and what all these issues are. You know, not a protest or anything, just he is coming, he's going to be there.
This is your right.
This is your right. You need to go and talk to that fella. Anyway, what happened is it really did escalate and everybody went plus their kids. So there was hardly any kids at school. And I was accused riots and was causing, it was kind of serious crime if in fact that's what I was doing. And there was an inspector come out and evidently I found out from the very sympathetic headmaster at the time that in fact there was some serious stuff going on and they're trying to, the enemies were trying to
radical
remove
intervention.
Me. I was radical and there's a lot of Aboriginal, a lot of
You're informing people that...
Yeah, it was really seriously that and a lot of other teachers there who were, and I still find it hard to believe, but it's true, who are scared of Aboriginal people. They're scared they're going to rise up and murder them in their beds. It's still, I was so surprised. These are people who I used to have dinner with. I couldn't believe it. And sort of, we were sort of, we'd come to the staff room, they'd walk out. They really thought we were stirring up something that was going to be really personally harmful.
So from that